Good evening. I'm Jacinta Ralston. I'm Pro Vice Chancellor Indigenous at Monash University, and it's my pleasure to be moderating this panel discussion this evening. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on the land here in Melbourne of the Kulin Nations, and I acknowledge ancestors past and present. I acknowledge the traditional owners of all of the mob who are joining us from across Australia today, but also across the world. There are Indigenous people across the world who are participating in this YouTube viewing tonight of this panel discussion. But most importantly, I'd also like to acknowledge the members of the panel who are joining us tonight, and we'll introduce them very soon. It's NAIDOC week, and for those of you who are outside of Australia, you might not know what that means. NAIDOC is the National Aboriginal and Island Day of celebration. It's a celebration week that we have every year, normally in July, but because of COVID, it's been delayed. And so it's a great pleasure for me to be doing this conversation tonight with a fantastic panel, talented people, but just passionate people. And I'm very pleased to be able to do that this week during NAIDOC week. I would like to acknowledge all of the streamers, all of the people who are joining us. I'm not quite sure yet of the count, but I think we had up to 400 registrations for viewing this live, and so it'd be fantastic to see how many we do get this evening. But the format of tonight's panel discussion, and I say night, acknowledging that for many of you, you might be in other bits of the country or other bits of the world where it might not be nighttime, but we're just going on 6 p.m. here in Melbourne. And but the panel discussion will happen in about an hour's time after we've heard from each of our individual panel members. They're going to speak to this fantastic new resource that's been established. And throughout this event, we'd encourage you to tweet, to make comment. You can tweet using the hashtag @MonashEducation. You can tweet about this fantastic resource that has been sent to you all and is available in the chat. You can post questions and comments in the chat in YouTube. And later on, when we go into the panel discussion, some of those questions we'll be able to have posed to our panel members to allow some feedback and interaction with you, the community who is out there joining us tonight. The community of practice, I would call you. So this resource, which I saw for the first time earlier this year, teaching First Nations content and concepts in the drama classroom, advice for teachers in Victorian schools. I think for many of you who now have your hands on this, who sit outside of Victoria, you'll appreciate the richness of what this resource is, and the fact that this is something that we can use certainly across Australia. But I would think also that the notions and the concepts that are in here are things that will be able to be taught in other settings, in other environments, drawing on other cultural influences, other histories. So I think it's, I was impressed when I first saw it. I continue to be impressed. And tonight I get the pleasure of being able to have conversation with the team of people who were involved in establishing this over the last 4 years. So please do join us throughout, be as engaged as you can. As I said, tweet, post questions, post your comments, and interact with each other as best you can through the YouTube comments section. But look, before we start, let me introduce our panelists tonight, and I think they're going to turn their cameras on so that we can introduce them and you at least see them all before we go into. So Rachel Forgaz, the Senior Lecturer at Monash University, Andrew Brine, who is with Drama Victoria, none other than Rachel Mazza, who many of us know. I've got to say, deadly woman from up North Queensland, where I come from, so a little bit biased there. And we've also got Kamara Balwicks and Danielle Haradsky joining us. And these are the powerhouse. This 5 individuals are the powerhouse behind this resource. It takes a lot of passion and commitment. Tonight we're going to hear a little bit about that story from each of them. So to start with, I think the panel members are now going to turn their cameras back off. Kamara is the first person who's going to to join us in discussion. Well, actually not discussion, she's going to talk to us about her experience. Kamara Bell Weeks, a descendant of the Yagara and Butchulla people of Southeast Queensland, I know that mob, is a playwright, dramaturg, director and teaching artist. Her award-winning health education shows Chopped Liver, Body Armour and Northwestern Nowhere were written specifically for prison, school and Aboriginal community audiences. Kamara has been one of the driving forces in this piece of work, and I was very pleased to meet Kamara earlier in the year and get to hear a little bit about her story. So I'll hand over to Kamara. Welcome, Kamara.
Thank you.
Happy NAIDOC Week.
Happy NAIDOC Week. Thank you, Jacinta. It's really good to be here. I've got a lot to say and a limited amount of time to do it. So I'll cut through the short talk and get straight to my final remarks. And I apologise if this does go a little bit over the limit. I'm really hoping that it doesn't. I joined Albidgery Theatre Company as their education and learning manager in 2014, shortly before the lengthy and somewhat problematic mandatory inclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures across the Victoria curriculum. During this time, I became acutely aware of how desperate and often clueless teachers and students were when it came to engaging with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content in the classroom. A steady flow of requests ranging anywhere from definitive lists of traditional and contemporary performance devices and conventions to personal contact details for Eddie Marbo's family from an aspirational Year 10 student who couldn't understand why Mrs. Marbo still hadn't replied to her many emails. In the lead up to NAIDOC Week and Harmony Day, the requests for spears, ochre, possum skin cloaks, cultural dancers, dig players, dot painters, bush tuckerers, friendly elders, language teachers, Dreamtime storytellers, or any other traditional cultural kind of thingy that isn't too expensive and can perform at next week's assembly would not surprisingly go through the roof. My response to these requests often went like this. Well, Albidgery is a theatre company, so we don't actually offer traditional cultural kind of thingies per se. But the website said you do Aboriginal performance. Yes, that's right. We're a First Nations performing arts company who reframe historical and contemporary experiences of colonisation, trauma, healing, self-determination, and re-authoring the dominant narrative, predominantly through the form of theatre. Yes, that's what I said, a traditional cultural kind of thingy, you know, like dancers, like what's its name? What's their name? You know the ones, they always perform at the Arts Centre. I tried Googling them and you were the first ones that came up. Do you happen to know whose country you're on? I'm calling from Australia. I mean, who are the traditional custodians? The Aboriginal people who own, no, I don't think so. Diamond Creek's quite expensive. That'd be Wurundjeri country. That sounds familiar. They were all wiped out, I think. You'll be happy to know that there are a number of Wurundjeri organisations offering a range of cultural services, including traditional dances. Well, how much do they cost? Can they be here next week? Don't you have their phone number? Well, how do you spell it? Were, and you get the idea. Despite how unintentionally offensive these culture on demand requests could be, they still weren't as concerning as the accounts I'd heard from teachers, good teachers, who despite all their good intentions were at a complete loss as to how to teach this topic safely. But no matter what end of the spectrum they were at, all of these educators were compelled by a desperate need to incorporate First Nations perspectives into their classrooms, and most of them were absolutely shit scared to get it wrong. This paralysis of integrity, as Wesley Enoch once referred to it, is extremely problematic because it reduces even the most inspired educators to conventional textbook teaching or a one-off ticker box approach, often reducing our histories and knowledges to a static and ancient culture, dismissing the fluid, evolving, vibrant and living experience of First Nations people and cultures that exist today. On all accounts, the lack of resources and infrastructure to support this huge task of compulsory incorporation of this teaching area was causing growing rates of anxiety and even resentment amongst Victorian educators, particularly when most of these teachers never received any exposure to First Nations cultures in their own education and were often grappling with inherent forms of bias and prejudice to the very subject matter that they were being forced to teach. In the drama classroom specifically, accounts of students dryly reading the same one or two First Nations plays that seem to be known to broader Australia, often not allowed and never on their feet, fiercely respectful of the content and the author's identity, or on the other end of the scale, students mimicking accents and resorting to ignorant stereotypes, both examples of an internal inherent racism that blocks any opportunity for connection, immersion, or understanding of the rich and complex material that they were failing to engage with. I felt a growing sense of need to address this problem, not just because I simply didn't have enough time to cater to the endless barrage of teacher and student requests, but because I felt genuinely concerned another opportunity for advancing Australia's understanding of its first people was about to be painfully and tragically missed. Around the same time, I went to a professional development workshop delivered by a highly acclaimed drama educator who had supported countless BCE students through their ensemble and solo drama examinations, and who were consistently achieving some of the highest marks in the state. His secret? Challenging historical and social character provocations, specifically fictional characters drawn from renowned global tragedies. Hiroshima, the Holocaust, prostitutes preyed on by Jack the Ripper. During the workshop, he raved of drama's profound ability to develop transformational empathy in both the performers and their audiences, and its capacity to offer deep understanding and insights to all involved, despite how complex and unfamiliar the situations. Eureka, I'd finally found him, a drama educator that hadn't forgotten the basic premise of our craft, dramatic truth. Thrilled, I asked him about the First Nations provocations he had offered his students during his 20+ years of practice. I mean, if you like shameful world histories, you can't go past the Australian colonisation narrative. Instantly, his whole demeanour changed. So paralysed by my question, I wondered if he'd packed his DAX with integrity. Oh, I could never try and pretend to talk for, I just wouldn't feel comfortable doing something like that. I mean, I'm not, they're not, I've never. I was confused. He had survived a nuclear fallout. Gas chambers. Had he survived a nuclear fallout? Gas chambers? Sold his body on the streets of London under the prayerful watch of a psychopathic serial killer? No, he explained, of course not. But through historical research, thematic deconstruction, in-depth exploration, and interrogation of the timeless truths and useful understandings that make up the human condition, his students were able to develop and embody rich, authentic characters shaped by their specific circumstances to offer an informed and insightful perspective, even about a time and place they'd never experienced. Great. So applying the same process to the genocidal colonisation, which is the shared history of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, no matter how uncomfortable it made us, shouldn't be that much of a stretch. I reminded him, and I want to remind all of you, we live in Australia. You live in Australia. Your students live in Australia. This is not ancient history. This is current local affairs that belong to all of us. Well, my colleague takes her class Northern Territory every year. I can give her your email if you like. It was in that moment, and so many others like it, such as the VCE drama student who was encouraged to change both her African identity and that of the Aboriginal character she'd chosen to portray to African American in her solo examination, simply because it seemed easier. For who, I wondered. Why were First Nations people, my people, getting written out of our stories, our history, our country again? Either mocked or avoided, exploited or patronised, humiliated or mystified. Even as the national curriculum mandates the compulsory inclusion of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures in all schools across all learning areas, this is barely a whisper back to the loud and persistent white noise of 200 and something years of colonisation and whitewashing. Done so well for so long that we have yet another generation of tertiary educated drama educators who don't know how to confidently speak about or celebrate the culture and the people of the country on which they live and raise their families. That my people, our ancestors, our desolation and survival, our struggle and strength is still not being bravely addressed or joyously celebrated, because to celebrate us, you have to acknowledge what we lost, what was stolen, what was destroyed, and what has been collectively lost and gained. Because you have to acknowledge that the formal history of this country was written by the oppressor, and that everything you have been told and believed is a lie, and that this legacy of trauma does not belong to us. It is not a part of our culture. It is a part of colonisation, and the true colonial narrative is a violent and ugly one. So instead, you say you're scared, or you don't want to get it wrong, or don't want to offend, and wouldn't know where to begin, or what? You just feel more comfortable with another generation being taught to look away. And guess what? First Nations people get it. In fact, we struggle with it every day in ways you can never understand. Our very existence, our identity as First Nations people living in this country is scrutinised, policed, attacked, challenged, dismissed, undermined, and punished from society, ourselves, and each other. Trained to enforce this system of desecration that took what is our very most basic human right from us in the first place. But we don't have the luxury of looking away. We have to engage in this painful, complex, and problematic process of decolonisation, re-remembering, refinding, reclaiming, retracing our cultural and racial identity, because the only other alternative is to give up, roll over, assimilate, and our grandparents went through way too much for us to do that. The fact is, history can't be undone, but there has to be a better way forward. And unfortunately, the responsibility of healing is more often than not placed on the victim because they simply have no choice. Armed with this knowledge of responsibility and the rare position I found myself in to actually do something about it, I took a pragmatic approach. I surveyed drama educators on their fears, challenges, and strengths as non-Indigenous educators working with this content in the drama classroom. And even after everything that I'd encountered, I was still shocked by the results. I really did not understand how large the gap was. From this survey, I articulated their responses and my observations into specific questions and situations that could be encountered in the classroom, from cultural artifacts to Aboriginal English to dreaming stories to footage from the internet. And I took these to a large and diverse group of First Nation artists to respond to, asking them to be as solution-based as possible. Not surprisingly, it was pretty easy for us to come up with a list of don'ts, but what we really needed, what teachers more importantly, students needed, was a comprehensive list of do's that would give them the confidence to meaningfully engage with First Nations performance and perspectives whilst protecting and honouring First Nations culture and racial identity. These conversations were far more complex, invigorating, frustrating and rewarding than I dared imagine, and we had only just begun to scratch the surface. There was so much differing opinion about what was acceptable and what wasn't. What was I really doing? Attempting to give written permission to appropriate us all over again? I'd felt like I'd put my neck on the chopping block and I was questioning if it was worth it and if it was even the right thing to do. Emotionally fatigued from the responsibility and potential risks and rewards of the project, I needed to rest, reflect, and wait. There was no rush. We'd waited this long for Australia to understand us. We could wait a little more. I knew the old people would let me know the right way. So the work sat in a box for quite some time until I met Rachel Forgaz from Monash, who was facing similar challenges in her role at Monash Uni, educating the educators. Her ambitions, challenges, and frustrations as a drama educator overlapped squarely with mine. We were both looking at the same situation from opposite sides of the fence. Rachel came with a passion, motivation, and a sense of responsibility as an educator to get this right, which re-inspired me to continue the consultation process. The next stage involved a smaller group of First Nation artists, and this time Rachel encouraged me to record the conversations as we went down the rabbit hole of trying to solve the unsolvable. How do students and educators learn about us when we are not there? Specifically, how do they embody us, tell our stories, respond to our characters, internalise our emotional truths in our absence? Again, unsurprisingly, our conversations hadn't grown any less complex, nor had my anxiety. I was feeling exhausted with the work. I'd stopped caring. It wasn't my job to hold non-Indigenous Australia's hand and guide them through a palatable, curated experience of reconciliation and understanding. Let them do the work. Let them figure it out. Because I couldn't. Our conversations were too differing, multi-layered, shifting, and non-negotiable to filter down into some type of layman's resource that could be safely and effectively used in the classroom. And that would have been the end of it, except Rachel Forgaz had her own eureka moment. She saw that the key, the magic of this work, was not in some finite do's or don'ts list or an easy list of solutions, but in these huge and seemingly insurmountable yarns about them. I did for a moment think she might have lost her marbles when she rang up screaming, saying that the conversation transcripts were the resource. To me, it was just us mob having big yarns about the big things like we always do. I never thought to consider that non-Indigenous people have no understanding or even concept of these discussions, and that these discussions revealed the much deeper truth about our perspectives and understandings than a list of do's or don'ts ever could. And the rest, as they say, is history, and now available for you in a downloadable PDF. The real lesson is, if you really want to make a difference, teach the next generation the true history of this country, the history you didn't get caught. The truth is, First Nations people hold many complex and competing opinions about what's right and wrong in regards to our collective identity, and our individual and collective accountability weighs far heavier on our shoulders than it ever will on yours, because we hold ourselves far more accountable than we will ever hold you. So do your research. Take the time and consideration to reflect and humanise. Play the truth, be brave, take risks, but remember, if it feels wrong, it probably is. Teach your students the whole truth. Sit in the discomfort. Be okay with not knowing. Don't let guilt or fear paralyze you into complacency or avoidance. And finally, do this work like our ancestors are watching you, because they are.
Wow, what a start for us, Kamara. Fantastic. We're going to keep moving through and we'll go to the next, but I think what you're all seeing there and what you're hearing is the heart behind this. And I think Kamara spoke to not just the burden that she herself was feeling, but, you know, for myself, and I'm sure for the others who've been a part of this process, she's spoken to the heart of the burden that a lot of Indigenous people feel when they're engaging this work, and the burden that a lot of our allies feel when they're trying to support the work. So fantastic, and thank you very much. Kamara's done a little bit of my job for me, which is introducing the next speaker. So let us keep moving. I'm going to introduce Rachel Forgaz, who is a Faculty of Education Senior Lecturer at Monash, so a colleague of mine. She's a secondary drama education specialist. She's a passionate teacher educator who researches and writes about the emotional dimensions of teachers' work and the use of embodied reflective practice to support teacher professional learning. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Jacinta. I've had to pull myself together after that, Kamara. Far out. I love working with you so much. I need a breath. And I'm going to just set this timer of mine so I hold myself accountable. I'm joining you all this evening from Boonwurrung country, where I live and work on the unceded lands of the Yalukit Willam clan. I want to offer my respect and my gratitude to their elders across all time. And I'm especially grateful to Ngāwit Caroline Briggs, who has deeply affected me through the words of welcome and wisdom that she has offered at various Monash events over the years. I also want to welcome the First Nation folks in our live stream audience, especially any members of the Ilbidri advisory groups who are joining us, representatives of VAI, and also Professor Peter Anderson from QUT, whose support of me and also his support securing a little bit of funding for this project was absolutely central in getting it off the ground. And I'm rapt to see just how many people decided to join us this evening. And I feel deeply privileged to be able to share a little bit of the thinking behind the design of our resource and how we intended that it would speak to teachers and to support their professional learning in very particular ways. But before I do that, I'm going to take a moment to use this platform and my privilege to go on the record condemning the removal of sacred Japarong trees by the Andrews government. The total lack of sympathy in the Premier's recent response to community concerns in the lead up to postponed NAIDOC Week celebrations and in the midst of Victorian treaty negotiations makes a mockery of both. And as the Japarong Heritage Protection Embassy remind us, a treaty is only ever going to work when non-Indigenous society is finally willing to respect Aboriginal law. The removal of sacred trees is against traditional law. Quite simply, no trees, no treaty. So, the idea of saying all of that was really scary. So much so that at some point I wondered whether I was going to do it at all. But a big part of my research is about the influence of teachers' fears and feelings on their decisions and actions. So when I found myself feeling scared about the idea of making that statement, I knew it was really important to stop and ask myself why. What was I scared of? Getting in trouble with the faculty, being disapproved of by you, accused of virtue signalling, grandstanding, misrepresenting the issue, oversimplifying, overstepping. And when I felt into all of those fears, it all came down to the same basic thing, self-concern. I was scared of what people might think of me if I said the wrong thing. And I was reminded, and you've already heard Kamara speak about this, of all the times I've heard teachers say that they don't teach First Nations content because they're scared of getting it wrong. It's never sat quite right with me because teachers are having to teach themselves new content all the time, and they don't let the fear of getting it wrong get in the way. Now, I'm not suggesting that the fear isn't real or that there's anything wrong with teachers feeling it. In fact, the only problem is that if they are left unresolved, these fears end up driving teachers' decisions not to teach First Nations content and perspectives. Now, one solution is to make it a mandate, and Kamara's already spoken about the curriculum mandate, but we saw another mandate come into play in 2011 with the release of the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers. Now, full disclosure, I am no fan of the teacher standards movement, but from an Indigenous education perspective, the inclusion of standards 1.4 and 2.4 were a very big deal. 1.4 mandates understanding the lives of First Nations students. Standard 2.4 requires teachers to understand and respect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to promote reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians as a basic standard of teacher professionalism. This was huge in theory. Now, in practice, it's also been hugely problematic because, as any teacher will tell you, compliance culture tends to be met with a cynical, bare minimum box-ticking attitude, you know, just tell me what you need us to do so my kids and I can get back to the learning that really matters. Not exactly the kind of attitude that breeds genuine understanding or respect. And even with teachers who are committed to promoting reconciliation through their teaching, there are still no guarantees because, like any of us, they will have absorbed a whole bunch of attitudes and biases about race just through their daily participation in settler colonial society. Despite whatever we might intend, it's our uninterrogated assumptions, our unconscious bias, our cynicism, our resentment, our values and beliefs. These all infuse our teaching in ways that are very subtle and deeply unconscious. And these are the tacit lessons our students learn from us. And in the end, they have much deeper and more enduring impacts than any content we're explicitly intending to teach them. So, this means that we need professional learning about teaching First Nations content and concepts like reconciliation that does much more than fill the gap in teachers' content knowledge. It has to support teachers to surface their fears and feelings and to unpack their own relationships with white supremacy, with institutionalised racism, with systemic violence, with privilege. And until teachers have done this work on themselves, it is impossible to really go there with their students. I know this through my research, and I know this through my own transformative learning experience collaborating on the development of this resource over the last 4 years. So, how do we do it? How do we create the possibility for teachers to engage in this kind of deep, transformative professional learning? Well, on the one hand, we know that deep learning requires incredible vulnerability on the part of the learner, the willingness to be wrong, to be challenged, to be different, which means we need a safe space for learning. And on the other hand, we're told that comfort breeds complacency, and if we want to improve and grow, we have to step outside our comfort zone. The elusive space between safety and challenge is where transformative learning happens. And in the design of our resource, we wanted to invite teachers into this sweet spot of possibility, where feeling into the fears and feelings might also begin to transform them and open up the space to connect teachers with the agency to teach for understanding, respect, and reconciliation. The resource is structured around a series of questions and answers, and there's a playfulness to our approach in which we create safety by speaking the unspeakable, posing the questions that a lot of teachers secretly want to ask with the attitude they want to ask them. And then we create challenge with tough love answers that are straight up and refuse to let them off the hook. Question, why can't you just give me straightforward answers? Answer, because there are none. Question, what if my kids do something racist? Answer, don't be surprised. Question, I don't know the first thing about First Nations cultures. How am I supposed to teach my kids about this? Answer, do some research. Find out. Our extended explanations are drawn from the perspectives of Kamara's advisory group members, including excerpts spoken in their own words. We create safety by being transparent. Complex questions don't have simple answers. So yes, there are contradictions, contingencies, and complexities at play. And the diverse perspectives of the advisory group members actually show that most of the time there is no singular right way, which kind of alleviates the fear of doing it the wrong way. We support teachers to grapple with unfamiliar views and confronting truths by unpacking them slowly and always framed by our appreciation of the complex and competing demands of their work. We activate teachers' agency, addressing them like intelligent and thoughtful professionals who can be trusted to make inquiries, consider alternatives, and then resolve them for themselves. What is right for my students in this context, in this moment, right now? The invitation that comes along with this is quite simply to embrace the spirit of Standard 2.4. Commit to understanding and respecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and teach in a way that promotes reconciliation between First Nations and Indigenous Australians.
Again, Rachel, so powerful. And I think what we're seeing already, as you can see in listening to each of the speakers so far, is again that passion and the heart. And Rachel, just kudos to you. The calling out and the naming of the tragedies that's going on in Australia, not just in the context of the trees, but in the context of land that gets blown up and flags that don't get flown in Parliament, which for those who haven't seen that news, you'll see that coming out, I imagine, in the next couple of hours, but it's a new piece of news this afternoon. This is really powerful stuff. And so we've had Kamara talk to us about why this piece of work was important, what voice we were trying to bring through this resource to the table, how the effort is being established to try to empower teachers out there to come along on the journey with us. Rachel bringing to us now, adding to that story, what's behind the resource, but how this can be used to try to address systemic racism. We're now going to invite Danielle to join us to talk about the future of the work, research and other partnerships. Danielle, whose sister and baby niece are watching and deserve a wave from us, I think, is a PhD candidate at Monash University, where she's recognised as one of the inaugural Radon Scholars for her project exploring the transformative professional learnings for engaging drama teachers with the complexities of teaching First Nation concepts and content. Danielle is also the Drama Victoria Theatre Festival Manager for Drama Victoria. Welcome, Danielle.
Thanks, Jacinta. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm living here on Bunurong country and pay my respects to all elders past and present. Thank you to all First Nations people here with us tonight and to everyone who's walked with us on this journey over the years. And I think it's really special to have babies watching us tonight because they're going to grow up and take this journey on for us in the future. I'm really honoured to be part of this discussion tonight and also to be involved with developing this resource altogether. I was invited to join this project by Rachel, who's my PhD supervisor. Reading through the original transcripts of the Ilbidgery Advisory Group discussions was such an incredible learning experience. In lots of ways, I just wanted to hand over those transcripts to all teachers and say, read this. But for practical reasons, that wasn't going to work. We needed to turn hundreds of pages of complex discussions into something reasonably short and easily accessible without losing those unique voices that made it so special. For me, starting to write this resource was pretty scary. We had a very tight deadline to get it done, which was good because if I'd had more time to think about it, I probably would have been overwhelmed and just gone and huddled in a corner until someone else did it. Rachel and I emailed back and forth so many drafts that I can't tell anymore which bits we each wrote. And even though our 3 names are officially on it, in reality, this resource has many, many authors. You can still read parts of the transcript directly in the many quotes from the Ilbidgery Advisory Group scattered throughout the document. But even the bits that I know are my words or Rachel's are really just bringing together the group's ideas, arguments, and perspectives. If I can adapt a quote from the resource, I feel like we wrote the truth. And truth doesn't come down to accents or skin colours or stereotypes. It's about emotion and experiences and feeling. I feel both very humble and very proud to have been trusted with sharing so many people's truths with the world. All through the process, I've been conscious that we were creating the resource I wished I'd had when I started teaching. And it's been moving to see this resource have such a positive reception from so many different people and groups. In particular, presenting the resource to VAI's Representative Council and having it endorsed by this group of amazing elders and educators was a very deep experience of the heart for me. When Kamara spoke about ancestors watching over us, that was definitely a time when I felt very, very conscious of that. All the way through, long before I came on board, this has been a work built on strong, trusting, reciprocal partnerships. The three-way partnership between Ilbidjeri Theatre Company, Monash University and Drama Victoria is of course really central. And at the heart of that is the people from these organisations who are presenting here tonight. The artists who originally joined the Ilbidjeri advisory groups, the drama teachers who are surveyed by Kamara at the start to find out about their areas of confidence and concern, the other drama teachers who tried out early drafts with their classes as part of the 2019 Drama Victoria Theatre Festival. More people than I can count have walked with us and helped to make this possible. VAI were a partner in this project from the start, and their endorsement this year, representing as they do Koori education across Victoria, really made it possible for us to take the resource into the next stage of its journey, which brings us to tonight. But what happens after tonight? Already this resource is being used in drama classrooms across Victoria. You'll hear more about this in a minute from Andrew, and also from Rachel Mazza about it, how it's finding its way into industry. And that's just so exciting that professional performers are finding it helpful to their work. We believe wholeheartedly that what is in this resource has application beyond the drama classroom. Teachers in all subject areas can relate to questions like, how do I get my students to feel interested in First Nations histories and cultures? And what should I do if there are First Nations students in my class? The answers include the advice to make the links, find out what experiences exist within the history of the kids within the classroom, because we're ultimately trying to humanise and make what happened to us here mean something to them. This is advice which is relevant to any teacher in any classroom. But some teachers, you weird ones who don't like putting on plays, need less advice on casting First Nations characters and the conventions of contemporary Indigenous theatre, and more perhaps on the rules for First Nations games or the hallmarkers of First Nations engineering. What we have created is not going to answer every teacher's questions. One of the ideas I've had in my head for a while now is how amazing it would be if every subject area had a resource like this, that brought the questions and concerns of teachers from that subject area to relevant First Nations experts, and then made the ensuing discussions accessible for all teachers. Although it's not at a point yet to make official announcements, I was very excited a few weeks ago to get an email from someone wanting to do exactly this. What we're hoping is that future resources can build on what we've created here, that some of the tricky, complex discussions that we've had, and which take a lot of time to have properly, and which are relevant to all subject areas, can continue to frame unpacking more subject-specific concerns. The model which we've created can also hopefully be replicated, and the existing partnerships strengthened as new relationships grow. Another plan is to develop a website version of this resource, which encourages educators, artists, and anyone else to join in a respectful conversation about how all this works. Because things change. The advice given here may not be 100% relevant in 5, 10, 15, 50 years' time. In fact, I hope it's not. I hope we're a lot further down the path to reconciliation, and some of the conversations we see as tricky and uncomfortable are just accepted truths. The other branch of this resource that I'm involved with and really excited about is research. Like Rachel said, we need professional learning that doesn't just fill the gaps in teachers' content knowledge, but that engages with uncomfortable, scary topics like the role of education in colonising Australia, which hasn't stopped, the ongoing racism in Australian schools, and what equality and equity really mean. My PhD project is exploring exactly this, helping teachers to engage with these topics, not just with their minds, but with their emotions and whole bodies. One of my participants told me the other day, I'm making an effort to try and understand why I am moved to tears or spike with feelings of anger. It is a challenging way to learn, but I will never forget these moments because they are shaping how I see our future." End quote. It's a privilege to work with these educators, and I'm very hopeful about how this work can inform future professional learning programs. Andrew, who you'll hear from in a minute, is also involved in research, exploring directly how teachers and students can produce contemporary Indigenous theatre in their classrooms. Someday, I hope our research will be available through a resource website, offering teachers stories, examples, lesson plans, professional learnings, and other support. I often say we're on a continuing journey, and it's amazing to see so many other educators walking with us. Thanks for coming along.
Thanks so much, Danny. I've popped in as a pseudo host because we lost Jacinta for a moment. I think she's going to be back with us shortly. It's actually a delight, Danny, for me to be able to say thank you to you. It's so wonderful to see how this work is just being carried forward by folks like Danny and Andrew Byrne, who I'm so delighted to introduce to you next. Andrew is a Gunai Kurnai man. He's the president of Drama Victoria and also the director of guidelines and projects on the board of Drama Australia. Andrew, and that's just what he does in his spare time. He's the head of performing arts at Paran High School, and he's completing a Masters of Education by Research at Melbourne University. Andrew was also a member of the 2016 Ilbidgery Advisory Group, offering an educator's perspective. So welcome, Andrew.
Oh, Andrew, you're on mute. You're on mute. Thank you so much, Rachel. To be introduced by you is an honour. You are one of my heroes. So thank you. It's so lovely to be invited along tonight to discuss the importance of this, well, quite frankly, unique and important teaching resource. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land that I'm zooming into you from tonight, the Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and I also acknowledge my ancestors, the Gunai Kurnai people from Eastern Victoria. I acknowledge and pay my respects to all First Nations people, especially those that are with us tonight, and our elders past, present and emerging. So just a bit of background for Drama Victoria is that we are the peak body for drama and theatre education in Victoria. And one of our purposes in our mission statement is to encourage ways that drama and theatre can be used as a tool to explore diversity and nurture inclusivity and positive representations of culture and identity. So this sphere of education support for teachers is very important to us and why we were thrilled to be involved in this process. I was really humbly honoured to have been invited to participate in this journey when Rachel and Kamara invited me to join the advisory panel that was convened through Ilbidgery Theatre Company. I was invited to represent the voice of teachers amongst the voice of artists. The powerful and moving and complex conversations that we had were sometimes difficult and enlightening, but I kept insisting to the artists that we need to understand that this is for education purposes, that teachers are crying out for support, they're wanting help, and they want to include First Nations perspectives, cultures, histories in their drama curriculum, and they want to get it right. And so over the past 4 years, alongside Rachel and Danny, I've been presenting professional development workshops at conferences, and the overwhelming feeling from teachers who attend these workshops, and I know that Rachel referred to this earlier, is that feeling of fear. The fear of getting it wrong, the fear of offending, the fear of not doing it at all. And I say to these teachers that it is important to acknowledge that fear. It's so important. It acknowledges that you know that this work is important. It's important for all Australian students, both First Nations and non-Indigenous. But the fear of getting it wrong and not doing it is worse than doing it and making a mistake. As teachers, we need to try. If we make a mistake, we reflect, we research, we redesign, and we try again. It is not good enough to say that it is too hard. It's not good enough. So teaching is hard. Teaching is complex, but that's our job. We're here to educate the future. So why does this matter? Rachel spoke earlier about the Australian teacher standards, but also the Australian curriculum has embedded within it the cross-curriculum priorities. These are to be included in the curriculum of all key learning areas across all year levels from P to 12. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Histories and Cultures priority provides an opportunity for all young Australians to gain a deeper understanding and appreciation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures, knowledge, traditions, and holistic worldviews. This knowledge and understanding of and connection with the world's oldest continuing living cultures will help learners to participate in the ongoing development of Australia as a nation. That's the Australian curriculum. Specifically, the Victorian curriculum states that the knowledge and skills that students are expected to develop about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders histories and cultures have a particular and enduring importance and assists students to understand the uniqueness of these cultures and the wisdom and knowledge embedded in them. And then drilling down even further, specific to drama, the Victorian curriculum also includes specific reference to ensuring that students are learning about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures through responding to and interpreting First Nations drama traditions and contemporary First Nations performances. So this can be applied in the classroom through both devised and scripted work. So as teachers, we must do this, but we have to move past that box ticking into meaningful embedding in our curriculum. So drama and theatre at its core is a powerful tool for students to develop empathy and understanding of other people's perspectives and lived experiences through the embodiment of role and character. And drama enables students to imagine and participate in exploration of other worlds. They use their body, they use gesture, movement, voice, language, taking on roles to explore and depict real and imagined worlds. When students play characters in specific situations, they are imbued with a sense of understanding their character's perspective, their feelings, their experience, and this develops their empathy. This can affect change. When students have a deeper understanding of another's experience, this is how the world can be changed, how oppression can stop, how injustices can be no more. So how can this be applied in the classroom? The resource advises teachers how to engage with dreaming stories. Maybe perfect for your primary students, a way to teach younger Australians about the beauty of creation stories and how they've been used for generations to teach. For teachers who want to explore a topic with their students, so whether it's colonisation, is it land rights, is it our First Nations heroes, is it stolen generations? The resource can advise you on ways that you can do this, tips on how to devise work in your classroom respectfully. One thing I love most about the resource is the discussion around intent. What is your intent with doing this work? Is it box ticking? Well, then I'd say reconsider it. Is your intent genuine? Then here, the resource says, here, I'm going to hold your hand and I'll walk with you through this journey. And I love this quote from the resource. Take the initiative and do the research work so that it is meaningful to you, personally meaningful. The resource also discusses an array of topics, but also ensuring that any art that you use in your classroom, whether it be a song, an image, a play, that either financial retribution occurs where possible, but also acknowledging the work of the artists. Look, there are so many more gems in this resource. I could talk about it for hours, but why does this matter to me personally? My personal journey with my connection to culture is complex, but as I reflected on my schooling, I can remember little exposure to First Nations culture and history. I have a faint memory of in primary school learning about the rainbow serpent. In high school, there was something about Aboriginal people being hunters and savages. Not really the right way to go about it. And I wanted to make sure that my students were taught a different perspective, an honest perspective, a celebratory perspective. So I made myself a promise. I would do better than I had experienced. So my focus over the last few years and the focus of my research is how can teachers and students effectively and meaningfully produce contemporary Indigenous theatre in the theatre studies classroom? And so I've worked with my students through the development and interpretation of scripts written by or in consultation with First Nations artists. My argument behind this work is that teachers, specifically in BCE Theatre Studies curriculum, are required to support their students to engage with and creatively and imaginatively interpret scripts for an audience. If we don't allow teachers to work with scripts written by First Nations artists, with First Nations characters telling First Nations stories, then teachers will continue to work with scripts written by non-Indigenous playwrights, and the beautiful and powerful work that has been created in this country will be ignored in the classroom. But, you know, how do the multicultural students in our classrooms play First Nations characters? It's a complex conundrum, one that wouldn't occur and shouldn't occur in the professional arena. And that is where this resource is such a valuable guide. It advises teachers how they can work in this sphere in their classroom with respect. There is practical advice on casting First Nations characters and how this should be addressed to your audience. Look, I found my students to engage with this work beautifully and finish the production with a newfound understanding and empathetic understanding of First Nations people's experiences, perspectives and histories that they didn't have before. So I encourage all drama teachers to embark on this journey that I've been on. It is rewarding, it is important, and it is our duty. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. And my apologies that I disappeared and wasn't able to introduce you, which means that you might not have got that introduction that you wanted, but we will do that when we have the whole panel come together, because I'm conscious I too still have to locate myself here. So we'll do that then. Well done. Thank you. And thank you to Rachel for stepping in. Of course, my internet went off when you least want it to go off. So we've now heard about how this started. We've heard the two players who were at the beginning of this, Rachel Borgaz and Kamara. We've heard how Danielle's been engaging with it, and we've now heard how Andrew sees this as being used in the context of teachers and that work, and why it matters. We're now going to move to our final panel speaker. My pleasure, as I said earlier, to introduce a fellow North Queenslander, Rachel Mazza Yindinji from North Queensland, Miriam from the Torres Strait Island of Mer, and Dutch on her mother's side. She's artistic director of Albijiri Theatre Company. She also sits on the board of ACME. For those outside of Australia and outside of Victoria, ACME is the Australian Centre for the Moving Image. She's a member of the Circus Oz Indigenous Advisory Panel. She's on the Australian Opera Indigenous Advisory Panel and the Green Room Awards Theatre Company Panel. Her contribution to the cultural landscape has been widely recognised through multiple awards, including the Australian Council of the Arts Award for the Theatre in 2019. And as well, she has an honorary doctorate of performing arts from Edith Cowan University. And to many of us mob in community, we just know her as the Deadly Black Woman. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Rachel to tell us why we need this. Thank you, Rachel. Thanks, sis.
Thank you, Jacinta. And thank you to all of you who have spoken before me. I am so inspired. I mean, it's just fantastic. This is such an extraordinarily important, critically important resource, and it's such an honour to be involved in a quite a hands-off way. So basically, I was quite devastated some years ago now when Kamara came up to me and basically said she's been doing all this work, and what's come out through a whole lot of research is that there's this phenomena in the teaching space where, as we've heard several times already, that there is this paralysis of all the best intentions and unable to kind of know how to navigate the space. So preferring in that feeling of awkwardness, preferring not to teach the content, First Nations content, rather than get it wrong. And this was devastating to me. I'm second generation Black theatre maker, and theatre was born. My father, in fact, along with Uncle Jack Charles, were the founding members of the first modern Black theatre company based in Melbourne, Mindafana Theatre, and it was absolutely all about creating a space where that was uncensored, where we had creative control, self-determined storytelling by blackfellas for blackfellas. It was very political, and it was a platform by which we could fundamentally start to address what's already been addressed today, is the gap in the narrative and the false narratives that have been told in the history of this country. So I saw myself as a theatre maker as having a critical role in that space of how do we flip those narratives? How do we, as I've sometimes said, rewrite, R-I-G-H-T, rewrite the narrative of this nation? We have often been presented with these false negative stereotypes and with a history that presents us as the dysfunctional narrative, and to flip that on its head into a strength-based narrative. Here we are, an extraordinary, resilient people who have the longest continuous living culture on this planet, who have not only survived colonization, which continues to this day, of course, but we survived ice ages. You know, we are extraordinary. And why isn't this the history that is taught in the schools? So my several decades now working in the theatre space, I have my most inspiring audiences are the young fellas. And it's the young fellas who ask the meaty questions. And I look into their questions, and I look into their faces, and I see the future of this country, their open minds, their open hearts. And it's so, I'm talking to our future leaders. And so for the importance of this work, to give this next generation access to the history that was denied us, that wasn't taught to in our schools. So, you know, the work that I do in theatre is shared by the work of the teachers, the extraordinary important role that the teachers play as the front line to that moment in which you stand at the fork in the road. We can tell the truth of the history of this country, and in so doing elicit respect, empathy, understanding, and in so doing be able to, you know, paint a new road forward. So the resource as it's written, the extraordinary thing about this is what I just blew my mind when I read it was how it totally demystifies and debunks a lot of there's a complexity in it told incredibly simply. So those kind of complex and hard questions about how do I talk about this, and what do I do if there's a First Nations student in the class, and it's so straightforward. You know, is it okay for my kids to ochre up, you know, my non-First Nations kids to ochre up, because that's what it says in the script? The answer is no. Like, anyway, it sounds so insanely simple. It was when I read reading all these responses. Anyway, it's such a brilliant resource, and the thing that it occurred to me is how vitally important this resource is for everyone. Like, as far as I'm concerned, there needs to be a version of this resource for directors, a version of this resource for politicians, for, in fact, anybody working as an executive producer and has First Nations staff, or in every context. I can see this application. The entrenched awkwardness that exists across this country is prolific, and there's a whole body of work that needs to happen. And the thing that is stopping us, there are a few, you know, anyway, there's a whole lot. There's definitely a proportion of Australians who don't want to hear the history, and they don't want to, you know, the hardcore end. But I believe that there is a good majority are ready and prepared to dive in, and as has been spoken about early, we all have a responsibility to step up, to ask the hard questions, and not, as I often say, don't be scared to ask the dumb questions, and be prepared to go down these complex and be curious and be hungry to dive into these conversations. And we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our ancestors, we owe it to our kids. So anyway, I think this is one of the most extraordinary, revolutionary resources. I'm so excited that it's happened. I'm so deeply grateful to Rachel, Monash, to Kamara, Bellwike. Your leadership and vision is just next level. Danielle, a drummer, Victoria, Andrew, the team that have made this happen. Congratulations. This is such an extraordinary, significantly important resource. I just want to see the many versions of this for the rest of the country, because I think it's important and it's needed. So once again, to those of you who are going to be holding this resource in your hand and taking it into your classrooms, just want to pay respect to the role of the teacher and the importance of the role that you play in this space, because it's you that are essentially creating the future leaders, and the work that you do with those will determine the future, the nature of the future of this country. Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rachel. What a nice way to end out all of these contributions tonight, just to be able to finish with that notion about this is about moving us forward as a nation and taking us to a different place. And I think this is the second conversation with teachers that I've had today where we can really kind of, let's not undersell the importance of what it is that teachers can do in their classrooms to help move our country along, because that's where tomorrow's people are. That's where our next generation is. They're going to be in those classrooms. Thank you. I'm going to invite the other panel members to turn their cameras back on. We now have a couple of minutes before we start to field comments and questions from that have come in from YouTube, which our great colleagues sitting behind the scenes will jump on and start to ask for us in a moment. But I guess I just wanted to say congratulations to all of you before we go into that. As I said earlier, I'm a North Queensland woman, so I was born on the lands of the Bindal and the Walgarookaba people in North Queensland. The significant thing about North Queensland is that there's been a lot of people come through the teacher education programs at James Cook University, cousin brothers, cousin sisters, family, friends, people who I've seen go out and work as teachers and work in schools for many years. I had a close connection to the education system through that family connection, and I can see the burden that a lot of teachers have carried throughout their careers. Indigenous teachers, Indigenous community mob who've been involved with the teachers, all of those. In Queensland, we call them community education officers, but down here in Victoria, we call them career education support workers or CESOs. They are the people who've been carrying a lot of this burden. And I think what you've done in this resource, which is just the most powerful piece, is that you've invited another sector of the education community to come along on the journey with us. So I want to ask a couple of questions before we start to open it up to everybody. The first question, and you might not all get a chance to, yeah.
Can I just really interrupt you for a moment, and thank you so much. I'm kind of having one of those out of body experiences, and it's not just because I'm on Zoom, but what I didn't do because I was a little bit nervous prior. I just want to first of all acknowledge the country that I'm on as well, the Wurundjeri country that I'm on, and my countrymen, my grandfather and grandmother's people, the Yagara people on my grandfather's side and the Butchulla people on my grandmother's, but also just to give a very special acknowledgement to my mother, Jeannie Bell, who is an absolute pioneer within her field, and that graduated from Monash Uni many years ago and was one of the first Aboriginal graduates from Monash, and who, if I turn out to be half the woman that she is, I'll be a pretty amazing human being. So I just wanted to add that I would not be anywhere near where I am, or having these opportunities or the power to kind of speak in the way that I do without her. So yeah.
Well, And it is, I mean, you know, we saw that NAIDOC theme a couple of years ago, because of her we can, you know, it's because of them we can. And so, you know, it is that legacy that we're walking. I was going to say, like, because my internet dropped out, I don't know whether or not it happened, but Andrew in our conversation in the chat before we kind of went on asked me to introduce him in a different way. And I don't know, Andrew, if you got a chance to do that. So I'd like you to do that now, if you would, before we go into the questions and the comments.
Oh yeah, thank you. I'd just like to introduce myself as a descendant of the Gunai people, but also of the convicts who, in some ways, were displaced as well. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I mean, like Kamara, I'd also like to acknowledge that, you know, I'm a settler here in the lands of the Kulin Nations. You know, this is not my mob. I'm a long way from home. I'm glad I can still get to salt water. That's one good thing. But, you know, we're all, by circumstances of our history, in different places and at different times, able to make different contributions. I heard before, I think Rachel, you might have said it, Rachel Forgaz, you might have said it, about the other individuals who've contributed to this project. So before we go into comments, I'd like to also acknowledge them. Colleagues, past and present at Monash, and our colleague up there at QUT, he knows who he is, and I know he's walked the journey with you. But also, you know, Bayai, I noticed Gandalf Philanthropy is on this as a contributor as well. Like, this is about many hands. So look, we're going to go to questions, and I think I'm going to ask Chantal if she's got a question, or Grace, if they would like to jump on. I think what they were going to try to do is try to group some of the questions and some of the comments together. So Grace or Chantal.
While we're doing that, Jacinta, I'm also just going to add in another thing. I'll tend to do this. Just a huge big ups to all of my people that were involved in the consultation groups and in the reference groups around this resource. The generosity, like just the ongoing generosity of my people to try and move this country forward is just astounding to me. And, you know, they know who they are, and yeah, just a really big ups to all Aboriginal people, all First Nations people everywhere, particularly at this time, and, you know, during this really sorry business that has happened down here. You know, I think it's really important to remember that it's very hard for Aboriginal people to celebrate at any time, but particularly this week in the face of, you know, what was such a blatant kick in the teeth and really what felt like a declaration of war from the Victorian government in regards to another one of our sacred sites being desecrated. So I also just want to acknowledge that, as Rachel did earlier as well. Yeah,
absolutely. So Chantal and Grace, did we have any questions from off the YouTube comments?
Yes, we do. We have quite a few questions starting to come in now. So
okay.
The first...
Sorry, Grace, before we do, we'll say there was 150 people who jumped online, and we've got about just short of 20 minutes left. So we might get through maybe 2 or 3 questions, but let's see how we go. Thanks, Grace.
I can give you a live update. We're up to 175 now, so it's jumped a little bit. So the first question I have here is from Alison, who's asking, how do we support educators to position themselves as learners with their students?
Who'd like to have a go at that?
I can take that one. I think actually the asking of the question is the point. That often teachers, some of the fear is because teachers are so used to feeling like they have to be the authority, and that as soon as teachers feel comfortable to actually share vulnerably with students that we are co-learners in this, and that is part of the story, right? That as a student, this is the history that I was taught or that I wasn't taught. And so it kind of harkens back to what Andrew said, you know, I want to offer you something better than what I got. But in order to do that, I need to learn with you. And in that, I think we really invite and we honour our learners, our young people, somewhere quite far ahead from, certainly, you know, just in their natural thinking and their what they feel is right. And a lot of the stuff that is unfortunately embedded in us, they just think is crazy and really not okay. So I think in owning our roles as co-learners, we invite our students to actually also be our teachers.
Fantastic.
Can I add on to that?
Yeah.
I would also challenge teachers to think, if we're not continuing to learn as teachers, then are we in the right profession? I don't think that throughout my career as a teacher that I've ever thought, I know everything now, I'm going to stop. I'll just teach the same thing over and over again. So I would challenge teachers that you need to be a continual learner as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Grace or Chantal, is there another question?
Yes, there is, Jacinta. We've got one from Peter. First, Peter also says that this event has been amazing, and also you've just done so well to explain everything from start to end. But he's got a question for Rachel, but it probably could be opened out to the panel as well. As educators, we often feel that we know. What tips do you have for educators to work through the emotions of shame and discomfort?
Hi, this is my research for the last 10 years. But you know what? Actually, I'm going to be very populist and quote Brené Brown, who I think is wonderful, and the simplicity of her observation that shame can't survive being spoken is extraordinary. That if we are willing to actually, first of all, we have to feel that it's shame that we're feeling, and that's sometimes hard, and some of the disinterest or the anger or resentment that I think teachers, that's our first response, and I own myself, that was my first response when I found out I had to teach teachers how to teach this stuff. When you peel back the layers and feel the shame, in speaking it, you're already traversing the divide. Shame is the thing that makes you feel like you're so bad and wrong that no one should connect with you. And when you speak your shame, you open yourself up to be connected with. And I think what you end up finding is that it's a shared experience. And in the shared experience, we can be compassionate and gentle with each other.
Would anybody else like to add to that? Danielle.
I can add to that. I think the way I really like to visualize it is that emotions can be comforting or discomforting, but they can also be productive or unproductive. So it's not that we don't want teachers to feel shame or fear. I feel those emotions. And I feel great sadness often when I'm teaching this. But if that shame, if that fear, if that sadness is stopping me from doing things, if it's unproductive, it's making me self-centered and wounding me and wounding others, that's not helpful. We need to move away from that, but that's not changing the emotion. It's working out how those emotions can be transforming and healing and collective, helping others. So not changing the emotion as such, but changing the way we approach those emotions.
Fantastic. Okay, I don't know if it's Grace or Chantal's going to ask the next question. Grace?
Yeah, so the next question I've got here is also actually for Danielle, but what advice do you have for other teachers who would like to get involved in similar projects outside the classroom?
Yeah, I think
Read it.
what I found is that as soon as I started saying, this is something I care about, this is something I'm doing, suddenly these opportunities cropped up. I've met people, I made friends, I built relationships, I got to work on this. Start a project, make a phone call, read a book, tell other people that you're interested in it, and you'll find other people that are on the same journey. And that's been an experience I know a lot of other people have felt as well, that it's that feeling of, oh, I'm going to be on my own with this, that can make you feel like not starting, but there are so many other people walking this as well. And we're all very happy to make new relationships.
add on to that, I think Rachel talked about this, I know I talked about this, is the importance of professional development for teachers. It comes back to that idea about that we need to keep learning. And I know that, you know, for Drama Victoria, it's been a focus of ours to make sure that at our that we're offering professional development. And I'm sure other states in Australia, their associations are doing the same thing. So it's about reaching out to your teacher networks and finding the opportunities to learn, to engage with this. So that professional development, keep learning.
Keep learning. I'm going to actually ask a question of Rachel Mazza, and that is, Rachel, when you spoke about the value of a resource like this for other groups. Often we see people rushing to cultural awareness programs and to, you know, other protocols and other ways of doing things. And you mentioned the need to be able to keep things simple. How does this sit in the context of other protocols, other documents? How do you perceive this as being something that over the next 5 to 10 years will change the landscape of this work?
As far as I'm aware, certainly within the performing arts space, there is nothing like this document, which is why it's so, on one level, it's so obvious. Like reading through it, it's every conversation I've had. It's, you know, I've been asked all of those questions at some point or another. Anyway, and yet it's so straightforward and simple, and demystifies it, uncomplexifies it. Is that a word? But there's, as far as I'm aware, there is nothing like this resource, which is why I was just like, my brain just flew off. Yeah. There's a whole lot of work that's been done around, you know, with all the RAP programs within organisations. There's you know, scratching at the surface of organisations and individuals needing to do work around cultural competency, but we are right at the beginning of that journey. There's that, and obviously, sorry, what's it called? Doing cultural awareness training. So there's been a lot of that going on, but once again, still only scratching the surface. And what often happens is all of these things feel, even wrapped, can feel token. So they're not worth the paper it's written on. And at the end of the day, it's how you implement it into your everyday, and it starts to inform your practice, the way you work as a team, or and that takes the preparedness to step out of how you've normally been doing things, which obviously applies to this space as well. Just hearing you, Andrew, talk about the teachers being, but it's a different way. It's being open to finding and being curious and wanting to find a different way of working. And I know it's mentioned in the resource, you know, where you can, engaging with local community. There's doing it differently is exciting, and should be seen as exciting.
Can I just add to that? I mean, for me as well, I think that, like, you know, just on a base level of what the outcome, hopefully, of this resource will be, maybe in 5 or 10 years, will just be that the palette for Indigenous First Nations theatre in this country will have become sophisticated enough and ready to actually kind of taste the wine of our fruits, because we've got like the best stories. We're making amazing theatre. There are so many amazing playwrights and writers and actors and performers, and our representation is just so sorely lacking. So it's actually just about hoping that they can catch up with us and stop missing out on all of the amazing theatre that we're making, and in turn that will create develop an empathy and an understanding and a shared journey for these new generations to come, so that we don't have to keep making resources like this, you know. So I mean, that's long-term goals, but I think that for me it's just, it's such a shame that there isn't the kind of confidence or capacity or ability to be able to engage in our work. And it shouldn't just be Bangarra, bless them, like, you know, amazing, have us on the map in so many ways, but there's out there's so much amazing work to be made, and we just want them to be lucky enough to experience that with us.
Oh, fantastic. Now I'm going to take, I think we'll have one more question from whatever's out there, and Chantel's standing by, so I'm assuming she's got one, and then we'll come back to some wrapping up comments, I think. So Chantel.
Thanks, Jacinta. We actually have sort of two-part question. The one is for Andrew, that was related to earlier, about what advice would you give to the other subject associations interested in doing this kind of work? And just as a final question to end, where just a general one from our social media audience have asked, what would you like to see happening in this space in 5 years' time?
Yeah, so for other subject associations, I mean, it's complex because this was a collaboration. You know, primarily there was money involved, there was funding, there was Monash, there was the Gandalf Institute. So there was a lot of sort of hands that went into this project. There's obviously Obituary Theatre Company. So for other associations who are thinking about wanting to develop a resource like this as well, you need to put in the work, you know. You need to spend the time doing it. It's not something that was just banged out over a couple of weeks, just of, you know, a couple of people sitting behind a computer. There was a lot of thought and detail going into it. So yeah, I know that's difficult. I know, you know, money is often an obstacle to developing things of this value, but let's put the value into the development of these so that all subject areas can have it. Let's put the money into it. It's valuable.
Yeah, very true.
May I add to that just briefly? I think, and Danny touched on this in her comments, that part of what is extraordinary about this resource is that, you know, the advice is to connect with local communities and you know, and form relationships with elders. That's the advice we often get in schools. But the brilliance of Kamara's vision was to kind of also recognise that this is a living culture, and we have First Nations people in industry. And so I think my advice for other subject associations would be to recognise this and to reach out to colleagues in industries so that the living culture and the living contributions, that's where I think there's so much excitement, and it's like being this massive blind spot. And it's part of, you know, what I learned from Kamara about the reason why so many white people get around with this idea that, you know, that First Nations cultures and histories and politics are something from the past. And so subject associations connecting with industry, I think, is a brilliant way for educators to lead the way in making contemporary connections.
Fantastic. So Chantel asked a question about where should this be in 5 years. I want, like Kamara, to comment. In 5 years, what would you like to see? How would this impact on your work, Kamara, in 5 years' time? Because in a lot of ways, this journey started with you. So what's going to be different for you in 5 years because of the existence of this resource?
Maybe I won't have as much work. No, I'm really joking. The idea would be, well, ideally that obviously this is being taught in a qualitative way across all classrooms. I mean, I love the idea of the possibility of seeing these types of resources come out of other learning areas. And I mean, just to add to what Andrew and Rachel said before, I mean, like, this was nearly 5 years in the making. Not that we were working consistently that whole time, there were large gaps, but, you know, these things take time to be done properly. And I don't think there are necessarily fast tracks to them, but that doesn't also mean that you can stop altogether because the steps aren't always just coming straight in front of you. I mean, I would just love to hear young people talking about our work and with a familiarity and with a way of talking about other kind of, you know, theatre pieces that we see in the classroom, Brecht, Shakespeare. I mean, I want the names of First Nations theatre practitioners to be known in this country. I want the demand for our work, and we're already well along the way, but the representation of our people and our stories is it's the key to the future in this country. We all need to be invested in it. And I'm hoping that this is one of the steps towards that, you know.
Wow. Look, I want to say thank you to all of you. It is a really difficult task to have 25 minutes to hear from each of you again. And I'm sorry that we haven't necessarily got back around to everybody properly, but the conversation tonight as a culmination of that 5 years of work, I think is just fantastic. The resource itself is of course out there already and will continue to go out there. I would hope that people do keep it simple. They don't reinvent the wheel, those other sectors. I mean, I come from health, right? And I can look at this and I can say, actually, there is stuff in this that we could apply when there are tips and hints in that we could apply when we're teaching tomorrow's doctors and nurses and other people, because some of this is translatable to other areas. So I really hope that we don't reinvent the wheel in a lot of places. I also think that there's a challenge for universities that we actually have people who are out educating people. And I'm, you know, Rachel, we need to talk about what does the implication of this mean for the community of practice at Monash of, you know, the educators who we now want them to engage with Indigenous content and for all disciplines. And so maybe there's a bit more work that I could drag you into as well in that space. But I think the most important thing, and I want to come back to this, tomorrow's leaders are in schools. They're being taught by teachers. And I guess the question that I would leave you all with, and our participants who are listening and viewing this, is at the end of the day, if we send kids out of schools in Australia and in other places around the world, I know we've got Maori colleagues joining us tonight and others from across the world who are trying to make an impact in the lives of Indigenous people. If we send kids out of school at the end of year 12 with them having not engaged this work properly, or these contexts properly, this history properly, have we really done our job educating them? That's the kind of final comment that I'm going to make. I want to thank you all again. I want to thank the organisers, Rachel, you and the team sitting behind you. Well done. Thank all of our people who joined us on the live stream, up to 173. I think we heard at one point from Chantal. The resource of the YouTube clips, this video recording will also be available.